5 psychological tricks dictators use to control the minds of millions. Right now, somewhere in the world, a leader is convincing millions of people to act against their own interests. They are not using guns or force, they are using something far more powerful, your mind. Think about it. How does one person make an entire nation obey? Not through strength, but through manipulation. And the scariest part, most of us wouldn't even realize it was happening to us. Throughout history, some of the most brutal regimes didn't conquer their people with tanks or terror alone. They conquered them psychologically. Stalin, Hitler, Mao, Kim Jong-un, and the rest, they all used the same toolkits, a set of psychological weapons so effective that millions willingly surrendered their freedom. But here is what makes this truly unsettling. These aren't secret tactics. They are hidden in plain sight, and if you know how to spot them, you will start seeing them everywhere. Not just in authoritarian regimes, but in corporations, social movements, and institutions around you. By the end of this video, you will understand the 5 psychological principles that have shaped the fate of billions, and you will never look at power the same way again. 1. The paradox of enemy creation. Let's start with something counterintuitive. Dictators don't actually want complete stability. They need chaos, but not the kind that destroys them, but the kind that benefits them. In 1984, imagined a fictional state called Oceania, constantly at war with 2 other superpowers. But here is the genius. Nobody really cared who was winning. The war itself was the point, because war requires sacrifice. War demands loyalty, and war makes people forget their own problems and unite behind a leader. When Hitler rose to power, Germany was fractured, economic collapse, hyperinflation, and despair. But instead of fixing these problems, Hitler created an enemy, the Jews, a scapegoat, and suddenly the entire nation had something to focus on besides their hunger. Was it true? No. Was it logical? No. But did it work? Absolutely. Here is the psychological principle at work. Humans are tribal creatures. We evolve in small groups. When we see an enemy, something ancient activates in our brain. Our critical thinking shuts down, and our loyalty amplifies. We become willing to do things we would normally reject. Kim Jong-un uses this constantly. Every few years, he creates a new enemy, the America, the Japanese, or internal traitors. The enemy changes, but the effect stays the same. The population remains unified, terrified, and dependent on the leader for protection. But why does this work so reliably? Because people want to believe in an enemy. When you are suffering, when you are confused, or when your life feels out of control, an enemy gives your suffering meaning. 2. The illusion of choice. Now, this is where it gets darker. You might think that dictators simply force people into obedience, but they announce the rules and punish anyone who breaks them. But the most effective dictators do something far more sinister. They make their people believe they have a choice. In North Korea, citizens can vote, yes, but there is only one candidate on the ballot. You might think that makes the whole thing absurd, but psychologically, it's genius. Here's why. When you go through the motion of choosing, something happens in your brain. You feel like you are part of the process, and that feeling, it makes you complicit. You are no longer a victim being forced to obey. You are a participant who made a choice. Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro held elections for years, even as the country collapsed. The results were obviously rigged. The opposition was suppressed, yet millions still voted. Why? Because the illusion of choice made people feel like they still had power. The Soviet Union took this even further. Citizens didn't just vote, they participated in democratic decisions. They attended mandatory meetings where they could theoretically have their voice heard. The government never actually listened, but the ritual of being heard, that was the psychological current. When you feel like you've had your say, you are less likely to rebel. You've already invested emotionally in the system. You've taken the ownership of the outcome, even if that outcome is your own subjugation. This is why so many people living under dictatorship don't flee. Even when they can, they have been psychologically invested in the system. They've made 1,000 tiny choices that, in aggregate, feels like commitment. 3. Controlled information and the distortion of reality. But to make the illusion of choice work, you need to control something else entirely: information. Stalin didn't just rewrite laws, he rewrote history. Political enemies who disappeared were actually erased from photographs. Their names were stopped from records. It was as if they never existed. And here is the chilling part. It worked. The Soviet people accepted the new version of reality because they had no other information to compare it to. But controlling information in the modern age is harder, so detectors evolved their tactics. In China, the internet isn't blocked entirely. You can access information, but you are wading through a carefully curated swamp. Official propaganda about the government's achievement is everywhere. Dissenting voices are buried under millions of posts. The data overwhelms you. You can't tell what's true anymore. This is called the forge of information, and it's more effective than simple censorship. When everything is propaganda, you stop trusting anything. You retreat into confusion, and confused people are easier to control than angry ones. Hitler's regime used a different method, but with the same results. The Ministry of Propaganda, led by Joseph Goebbels, didn't just suppress opposing viewpoints. They flooded the information landscape. Goebbels once said, if you tell a big lie enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. And he was right. But it's not because the people are stupid. It's because human brains have limited processing power. When you hear the same message from 1,000 sources, your critical thinking gets fatigued. You accept it as true simply because denying it requires constant efforts. But information control goes even deeper than this. 4. The dehumanization of enemies and the power of language. Here is a question that historians have asked for decades. How did millions of ordinary German citizens accept the Holocaust? How did they participate in, or as maximum tolerate, the systematic genocide of 6 million people? Before Hitler ordered the death camps, he spent years using language to change how Germans thought about Jewish people. They weren't referred to as people anymore. They were a plague, and they were a problem that needed solving. When you call someone an animal or a disease, something shifts in the human moral equation. The normal empathy circuits in your brain shut down. It becomes easier to justify horrible acts. If they are not people, then harming them isn't murder, it's pest control. This isn't unique to Nazi Germany, it's a universal tactic. In Rwanda, in the 1990s, the Rao called educated people parasites and enemies of the revolution. The language comes first, then the violence comes second. But here is what's genuinely disturbing. Once you start using dehumanization language, it changes how the people using it think, not just how they speak. Studies show that when people use dehumanization language repeatedly, their brain actually becomes less responsive to the suffering of the target group. You actually rewire your empathy. The psychological trap is this. Once you accept dehumanization language, you've crossed a line. You've accepted a premise, and from that premise, almost any atrocity can be justified logically.